Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of T.N.T Garage and Performance, and today we're doing the first video of many on the history or 101 videos. So today obviously we're going to start with a history video, and that is the history of one of the most beloved cars of the 80s, one of the cars that it doesn't matter what kind of background you have, where you're from, how were you brought up, if you're an 80s or a 90s or a 70s, hell, if you're a baby boomer, a Gen X, a millennial, and even some Gen Zs, we've all been brought together by one thing, and that is our love of the G-body Monte SS. And even though we like to customize them different ways and may not see eye to eye on it, one thing remains constant, and that is this being one of the greatest cars ever produced by GM in the 80s, and quite arguably the last successful muscle car to ever leave GM. So, that being said, let's get into the video. Well, before we get to arguably the last successful muscle car from GM, let's look at the history of the Monte Carlo. The impetus for the first generation Monte Carlo, which was introduced in 1970, was the restyled 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix, which many would consider the most beautiful Grand Prix of all time. And that was spearheaded by John DeLorean, who was the head of Pontiac at the time. Chevrolet, not wanting to be left out, Pete Estes decided that they needed a car that was in the same realm as the Grand Prix. Now, the Grand Prix was based on the A-body platform, but a stretched version of it from the Firewall forward, which is considered the A special platform, and a Monte Carlo would share the same platform and dimensions, using the same firewall, front and back glass, and deck lid as other A-body vehicles. And Chevy's version would be known as the Monte Carlo and was introduced for the 1970 model year as John DeLorean took over and introduced the car. It ran for 3 model years, 1970, 71, and 72, and each year had something a little different. Every year had a different grille, marker lights, which moved from the bumper to beside the grille in 72, and the headlight bezels changed from 70 to 71. The 454 SS was a top dog option featuring the LS5 345 horse 454, and that would carry on into the 71 model year and be discontinued in 72. With crash safety requirements changing in the future, 1973 was a change for the Monte Carlo as well as the rest of the GM lineup. In 73, they went to a colonnade style coupe. So colonnade simply means a pillared coupe, like you'd see old houses with pillars out front on their porch. It's a colonnade style, so that's why these cars were named as such. So there were 2 distinct different Monte Carlos throughout the 70s in the colonnade style. The first was the 73 to 75, which had the round headlights and also introduced the more recognizable taillights that we would see in the 4th generation Monte Carlo in the 80s. The biggest changes to the car was there was no more 454 SS, of course, that was discontinued in 72, and the Monte Carlo became more of a luxury car rather than a sport personal luxury car. It's just simply a luxury car with all kinds of options like swivel buckets and everything like that. 76 to 77 would have slight changes in the fact that it had stacked rectangle headlights, but in the whole colonnade style Monte Carlo, it really introduced and drove home the sweeping body lines that were on the front fenders and the rear quarters that started high and swept low into the body, and they were very pronounced in these years, and they'd be a staple of the Monte Carlo clear through the 80s. After the 77 Monte Carlo had finished its production, GM was now again changing its entire lineup to downsize everything. And in 1978, the downsized A platform Monte Carlo was introduced. Big changes were it went to horizontal taillights instead of the stand-up taillights that we were familiar with in the Monte Carlo. Front end would have single square headlights in a much smaller package all the way around. And light changes were made between 78 and 79. That 79 would have wraparound taillights instead of just taillights being relegated to the back panel. And these cars would be seen with the first 4-speed since 71, which was dropped in 1980. And the other changes to the car throughout this short production run of 3 years. In 1980, the Monte Carlo would see 4 headlights, a little change to the grille, and also the high performance option was the turbo Buick 231 rated at 170 horse. So the Monte Carlo is starting to gear up for a higher performance future, even in 1980. Now, in 1981, an all-new Monte Carlo was introduced. It was still an A-body in 1981 and wouldn't become a G-body until 1982. The reason for that is in 1982, the new intermediate front-wheel drive cars would be introduced, which would adopt the A-body moniker, which would bump the Monte Carlo, the Cutlass, the Grand Prix, and the Regal to a G-body designation. The turbo is still available in 81, but was dropped in 82 because it just wasn't a very reliable turbo setup in these cars, trying to get a very early turbo working on a carbureted V6. Now, with the 4th Gen Monte Carlo, of course, it was in NASCAR. And it wasn't super successful in NASCAR because it was basically a flying brick with a kind of lean forward nose on the front that really didn't help its aerodynamics at all. So for the 1983 model year, GM decided to finally do something about it, and they introduced the Monte Carlo Super Sport. The nice thing about the Monte SS in 1983, unlike most other cars that everyone got excited because it was the next Cobra, the next Z28, the next any special car, the Monte Carlo wasn't just an appearance package on the SS. It was more than just a new nose, a spoiler, and some stripes. This was a true dyed-in-the-wool performance car. Now, behind the nose and under the hood of the Monte SS sat a 175-horse L69 designation 5-liter V8. It may not seem like a lot now that we live in the days that your basic family car makes 350 horse. The stock 305 in 83 was 150 horse. So this was a pretty good bump up over the stock V8 that you could get in a base Monte Carlo. Now, if the L69 designation sounds familiar, that's because the L69 was also in the Camaro Z28, rated at 190 horse. It shared a lot of components with the 150 horse LG4 5-liter, with the difference being a different set of pistons to jump the compression up a full point from 8.5 to 1 to 9.5 to 1, plus a much hotter camshaft. Otherwise, the heads, the intake, carburetor were pretty much all the same. And we'll get into the performance aspects and the in-detail aspects of everything about this engine later in the video. Now, backing up that hot 305 is a TH350 3-speed automatic with a 342 gear and a 7.5-inch 10-bolt. Now, in the Monte Carlo, that was really the only downfall, is they didn't offer the 8.5-inch like they would later offer in the Grand National, and that would be optional in the Olds 442. But the nice thing is, both those cars being G-bodies, if you find one that's an 8.5-inch, it'll swap right into the Monte Carlo with no issues. Now, as far as other things to go along with the SS package other than the powertrain, Of course, you got the nose, the spoiler, but you also got certain stripes that went around the body of the car, and it was offered in two colors. You could get white, which was the most common, or the gunmetal blue, each of which would have their own specific stripe color. White would have a blue stripe, blue would have a gray stripe. On the inside, you got a complement of full gauges, including attack, oil pressure, bolts, temp, and of course, fuel gauge. And it would have a more upscale interior. It would have a blue interior with white on the door panels and the headrest with SS embroidered into them. So it's a pretty cool looking interior, with the exception of they only got the base Monte Carlo steering wheel. Nothing special there. The same wood grain plaques on the dash, and it was only offered with a bench seat. So they were getting there in 83. They just didn't go all the way, along with the fact that that 342 rear end was only available in an open diff. So it was one wheel peels all day long, letting that 175 horse rip. Now, in 1984, GM decided to up its game on the SS a little bit. First thing is, they reintroduced T-tops on the Monte Carlo, gave it a specific SS steering wheel, which was Monte Carlo only, but the dash was still the same, with the same wood grain and all that stuff that you'd see more in a luxury car. However, they did introduce the straddle buckets and a center console with a floor shift in the Monte Carlo for the first time in the SS, and also bumped the horsepower of the L69 up to 180 horsepower. Also, 1983 and 84 would be equipped with a specific set of 15-inch styled steel wheels that would carry on into the next year, 1985, where more changes came to the Monte Carlo SS. So in 1985, GM decided that they need to borrow a little bit from Johnny Cash and made sure that the Monte Carlo looked the best in black, which would be the bane of every Grand National owner's existence from then on. When they were driving around and someone saw their car and went, "Hey, nice Monte." Along with the color black, the Monte Carlo is also offered in now maroon, silver, and of course, carrying along white. And the stripes would change as well on the Monte Carlo. Still around the body of the car, they would also sweep over the wheel openings and be offered in a two-color package that looked much better and a much better font of the Monte Carlo SS decals on the doors and deck lid. The stripe colors would be specific to the color of car. So if you got a black or maroon Monte Carlo, you would get a red over orange stripe. And if you got a silver or a white Monte Carlo, it would be a red over black stripe package. As far as the interior, more changes would be made, getting rid of the blue color and introducing two new colors for 85, which was both maroon and gray, which most of which we see are maroon, with the gray being more rare and more desirable. The dash plaques went from wood grain to a semi-gloss black with a Monte Carlo badge on the far passenger side, along with the steering wheel also being black and getting its own horn button that designated SS in the center of the button. Performance-wise, the 305 itself didn't change, but 1985, the Monte Carlo now got the electronic quadrajet, which in an age of GM figuring out fuel injection, specifically with the tune port fuel injection that was found on the Corvettes and F-bodies, why they didn't go to that and decided to add electronics to a carburetor, which we know doesn't work, they decided to ruin a perfectly good quadrajet. Also in 85, it would be the introduction of a new transmission in the Monte SS, and that would be the 204R 4-speed overdrive transmission. A lot of people have kind of talked and pontificated on why Chevrolet just didn't put the 700R4 in the Monte Carlo, believing that the 700R4 was the better transmission. The case is between the 204R and the 700R4, they were pretty equal. The early 700s were not that great of a transmission, which put them right on par with the 200. However, the benefits of the 200 were they were lighter, they were the same length from the bell housing to the tail shaft as a TH350, which required less work to put it in the car, and it had overall better gear ratios for performance. Now, a lot of you might look at the gear ratios of these two transmissions and see that the 700R4 has a lower first gear, which you'd think would make it better for acceleration. But the 204R had a much tighter gear set. It's a lot like an M22 close ratio versus an M20 wide ratio. The closer ratios in the 200 provided better acceleration through the fact that it kept the car in the power band for much longer. When you're shifting gears, it didn't drop out of peak power like it would with this wider spread of the 700R4. And behind that transmission, they also did away with a 342 rear gear and introduced a 373 in the Monte SS, also available with the G80 locking differential. Now in 1986, a couple other small changes would come to the Monte SS, which just happens to be my favorite year. The biggest change that really made the Monte Carlo SS look like a performance car from the outside is they ditched the steel wheels and they went with the new N90 wheels that were similar to the 80 and 81 Z28. They were not the same wheel. The reason is that the Z28 used shank lug nuts and a 4 1/4 inch back spacing, whereas the Monte Carlo SS wheels use conical seat lugs with a 3 3/4 inch back spacing, making the dish in the wheel deeper with a slightly different outer lip. In the interior came some much needed changes as far as appearance. Now the satin black panels were gone from the dash, replaced with gloss black with red accents outlining them, as well as coming into the gauge cluster, which also changed from the 83, 84, 85 to 86. Now had, instead of just all black gauges, gray in the center with a light blue outline around it going into yellow and orange on the red line of the tach. Also, a digital radio was introduced for the first time with digital tuning, and a third brake light was added because of government regulations for a high-mounted third brake light, and the aero mirrors were introduced, taken straight off the Corvette and the Camaro Z28. So as a spotter, to tell the difference between the 85 and 86, look for a third brake light, bigger mirrors, and that's what you can really tell from the outside if you can't get a look at the interior. Also in 86, NASCAR came calling because as successful as the new Monte SS was with its aero nose, they needed something that didn't create as much lift on these super speedways, which a notchback roof, a more formal roof line, creates a bubble that creates lift at the back of the car. So for 86, GM introduced the Aerocoupe Monte Carlo. There was only 200 examples made to fulfill the NASCAR requirement that they need to build that many cars and sell them in order for them to be legal in NASCAR competition back when NASCAR was based on stock cars. So 200 Aerocoupes would be released to the public, and they were all only in white. Now, the way to tell an 86 Aerocoupe from the 87 Aerocoupe is, of course, the stripes are different, 86, 87, and the rear of the car would change slightly, which we'll get into jumping into the 1987 model year. 87 would see a few changes to the Monte SS. The most notable change would be a new bumper and taillights that were lifted straight from the redesigned 1986 Monte Carlo Luxury Sport. This involved taillights that wrapped a little bit around the edge and a rear bumper that closed the gap from the bumper to the bottom of the deck lid, making a much smoother transition and a little better looking rear end. Other exterior differences were the stripes had changed yet again. They went from a two-tone color to a single color and dropped them a little lower on the car. Also, instead of having the written out Monte Carlo SS on the door, they would stack the SS over a much smaller Monte Carlo decal. Along with those changes to the stripes, the color changes came as well. Now, on a black or burgundy car, the stripes were all red instead of the red and orange in 85, 86. And if you got a silver car, you got black stripes, which was a change. And the white cars would also get red stripes. A new stripe color, however, was introduced in 87, which was gold, and one of my favorite layouts of all time. You could get gold on a black or a white car, which also bled into the interior for the first time ever in 1987. Along with maroon and gray interiors, you could get a new saddle interior with your gold stripes on your black or white car. Other changes in 87 saw the introduction of another spoiler that could be optioned on these cars and was most typically optioned on the Aerocoupe, and that was the lay down rear spoiler, which would show down mid-year as another option to the stand-up rear spoiler that was very common on the non-Aerocoupe models. Also, too, finally, they got rid of the 85 mile an hour speedometer, introducing a new 120 mile an hour speedometer, otherwise with the gauge cluster staying exactly the same. Now, 1988 would be the swan song of the Monte SS, with GM pushing their intermediate front-wheel drive coupes in form of the Grand Prix, the Cutlass KLA, and the new Buick Regals coming out. There was no changes in 88, with the exception of no more Aerocoupe was available. Now, all 88s were built in 1987. It's just a carryover production. They made them 88s, and the stand-up spoiler was also gone, meaning that all Monte Carlos had the lay-down rear spoiler. Now, for its time, the Monte Carlo was a very popular car in general, and the SS was very popular itself. We'll run over the production numbers quick just to show you how its popularity grew over its model run. So in 1983, on its initial introduction, 4,714 Monte SSs would make it out of dealerships to the public. In 1984, that number would jump to 24,050 that would make it out of the dealerships. In 1985 would see another jump to 35,484 cars, growing again in 1986 and its peak year of 41,164 cars. After 86, with everything going on in the automotive landscape and these other sport compacts coming out that, quite frankly, embarrassed the Monte Carlo time to time, any turbo Mopar at that point. In 87, the Monte SS would sell 33,199 units, and in 88 would drop to 16,204. But out of 732,959 1981 to 1988 Monte Carlos total, 154,815 of them would be SSs. So there are quite a few cars still out there today. And now it's time to get into the real meat and potatoes of the performance and the specs of the Monte Carlo SS throughout its run. And just to quell any kind of conversations about it, no, the Monte Carlo SS was never offered with anything other than the L69 5-liter V8 in America. Because in 1984, yes, you could get a Monte Carlo SS with a 350 and a 4-speed. But the changes to the car were it had a Grand Prix interior, of course, in blue. It did not have a rear spoiler, and instead of coming on the 15-inch steel wheels, it came on the 14-inch, what we call checkerboard aluminum wheels that were on the lower end Monte Carlos, the non-SS Monte Carlos. But that was an out of US spec only car. In the United States, the Monte Carlo never came with anything bigger than the 305. Well, let's get down and dirty in the weeds of the 5-liter or 305 cubic inch L69 V8 in these Monte Carlos. Like I had stated before, the general engine was the same as the lower power LG4 305 that had a different cam and a different set of pistons. But the heads weren't that bad on these cars. So on all 305s, the LG4s and the L69s, which a lot of people call the high output 305 heads, which is just a misnomer because they were the same heads. Whereas the fact that they were 416 casting up to 86, and we'll talk about from 87 and 88 in a second. But let's talk flow numbers on these 416 quote unquote 5-liter high output heads or Monte SS heads. They flowed at max lift of the cam, which is about 0.04 of an inch, 180 CFM on the intake, and 115 CFM on the exhaust. Now, those are pretty respectable numbers considering these had a 58cc chamber and had a 186 intake valve with a 150 exhaust. Now, if you compare those heads to the top dog L98 Tune Port 350 heads that were on the Corvette with bigger valves, 194 intakes with 150 exhaust, those flowed 190 CFM at 400 lift. So, really, for the day, even these base 305 heads were pretty good. And what a lot of people find when they put these high output heads, the 305 heads on their 350, it's like, oh, I get a bump in power. Well, that's not necessarily because they flow better. It's because of the smaller chamber giving you higher compression. These heads did flow quite well for having small valves and being just a basic casting. There was nothing special about the heads at all. It's in comparison between those 416s and the L98 heads. The Vortec heads of today on the 350s, with a 194 intake and a 150 exhaust, flow 220 CFM on the intake and 140 on the exhaust at that 400 lift range. So, like I said, not great, not bad, especially when you compare it to the other heads of the day. Now, in 87, GM started going roller lifters, which changed the blocks a little bit. All blocks from 87 up were cast to be able to run roller lifters with the bosses in the valley to bolt the spider down for the dog bones to hold the lifters straight where they need to be. However, the Monte Carlos were continued to be flat tappet. So they used the same cam all the way through the production run. The only difference is the block casting was different in 87 and 88, and the heads were slightly different as they were an 081 casting, but pretty much were the same as far as flow numbers. The valves were the same size, the chambers were the same size. They just used the center bolt valve cover design that we're familiar with from 87 on up. Otherwise, still flat tappet cam and still the L69 cam, which we'll get into right now, that at 50 thousandths lift, it would have a 202 intake and a 206 duration with a 403 lift intake and a 415 lift on the exhaust on 114.5 lobe separation angle. So it was a pretty aggressive cam for the day if you compare it to, say, the peanut cam that we call it in the automatic equipped LB9 Tune Port 305 that maxed out at about 350 lift and had a little less duration. So a pretty aggressive cam for the day, especially for a flat tappet. So they did provide a good amount of performance. And again, of course, the L69s kept the different pistons to bump a full point from 8.5 to 1 to 9.5 to 1 compression, which is where a lot of the power came from. But if you compare the L69 in the Monte Carlo versus the L69 in the Z28, the Monte made 180 horse and 225 foot-pounds of torque, whereas the Z28 got 190 horse and 240 foot-pounds of torque. Now, I'm going to chalk that up to the exhaust on the Monte Carlo. They used about the same manifolds, those awful log-style manifolds that came out of the ports, went up across the other ports, and dumped at the rear. The Monte Carlo used a Y-pipe off of the manifolds into a single cat, back out into dual pipes, into mufflers per each pipe to dual tailpipes. The Z28, I believe, got its boost in power just from its exhaust. It did have a single cat that was Y-piped into the cat, but it had a larger single exhaust from the cat to the back of the car into a single muffler into dual outlets, which was a freer flowing setup, which I believe allowed the Z28 to make that 15 extra foot-pounds and that 10 extra horse. Now, as far as transmission specs in these Monte Carlos, between the TH350 offered in 83-84 and the 204R offered from 85 to 88, TH350 had a first gear of 2.52, a second gear of 1.52, and a 1-to-1 third, which going to the 204R, it would get a 274 first gear, a 157 second gear, into a 1-to-1 third gear, and an overdrive ratio of 0.67, which really kept the car in a power band and made it seem more sporty on the streets. Now, you take those 204R ratios and compare them to the 700 of the day. The 700 had a 3.059 to 1 first, a second gear of 1.625, a third of 1 to 1, and an overdrive very close at 0.06 or 0.69. Well, so how did the Monte SS stack up against its peers in the 80s as far as muscle cars go? Well, with Pontiac's attempt, especially in a NASCAR style, the Grand Prix 2+2 was truly just an appearance package. Its 5-liter only packed 165 horse, giving it a 0 to 60 in 9.3 seconds and a quarter mile in 17 seconds, because for some reason Pontiac decided to put a 308 gear in the back of the car, which, along with its lower horsepower, really killed its acceleration numbers, making the Grand Prix just a pretty car, and that's about it. It performance-wise could not touch the Monte SS. Old's offering between the Hurst Olds and the 442 had a 180 horse-ish 307 and a 373 rear gear. However, the car just couldn't muster the numbers that the Monte Carlo could. They did 0 to 60 in just about 9 seconds or less, anywhere from 8.5 to 9 seconds, and ran a quarter mile in the mid-16s, which was slower than the SS. Now, the Monte Carlo's main competition in the 80s, as far as peers go, were the Grand National. And in 1985, the Turbo 3.8 Grand National made 200 horse, ran 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds, run down a quarter mile in 15.7 seconds, and had a 342 rear gear. So quicker than the Monte on the drag strip, but very close on the street. Where Buick would completely decimate the Monte Carlo was in 1986, where they intercooled it and give it a little more turbo for 235 horse, doing 0 to 60 in a blistering 14.8 seconds and a quarter mile in the high 13s. Again, with the same 342 gears. So the Grand National certainly was a car to be reckoned with, which makes you think, could the Monte Carlo have kept up with it if Chevrolet would have put the LB9 305 tune port injection engine in that car? Which I guess we'll never know. But the Monte Carlo's low 8 second, high 7 second 0 to 60, and its quarter mile in the low 16s still made it a pretty viable car compared to the Grand Prix, the Olds, and the early Grand Nationals. Also, too, even though these cars were in the same realm, none of them could handle as good as the Monte. In fact, a lot of magazines up to 85 praised the Monte Carlo overall for being just the better performance package because it had the acceleration and a quarter mile to keep up with the Grand National 85, but far outhandled all the other cars. Now, the Monte SS was quite the good performance package of the day. It was a fairly quick car, especially in 83 to 85, and could 60 foot almost anything out there. But it was soon becoming clear that front wheel drive was going to be the way forward. And quite frankly, in the 80s, in 85, 6, 7, the Monte Carlo would get outright embarrassed by the turbocharged front drive Mopars that had the name Shelby on them. So, even though it was a great car with the V8 rumble, with the comfort of the Monte Carlo, and the handling almost on par with the other performance cars of the day, it just wasn't adding up to something that GM could make money on. Because at the end of the day, car companies aren't out here to make cars. They're out here to make money. So, unfortunately, 1988 would be the end of the line for the beloved Monte SS. And well, now we get to move on to the reintroduction of the Monte Carlo after a 7-year hiatus, and well, I think we need a different venue to explain this car. I figured our change of venue is pretty fitting because anytime I talk about the reintroduction of the Monte Carlo, I kind of have to make it in here because GM almost did the right thing by just killing the Monte Carlo in 88 and never talking about it again, seeing as they were never planning to go with another rear drive Monte Carlo ever again. So, let's get on with it. Well, after 4 years of the Monte Carlo being dead and being replaced with the front wheel drive W body Chevy Lumina and the two-door Lumina, GM decided to start teasing us with the return of the Monte Carlo, which in, I believe, 1992, they released a prototype of the 5th gen Monte Carlo, which again was a two-door personal luxury coupe that really wasn't that attractive in my eyes. It still just looked like a Lumina, which GM followed through with their promise and reintroduced the Monte Carlo in 1995 as a rebadged two-door fucking Lumina. And along with our Monte Lumina, they didn't give us the SS option, but instead gave us the Lumina's Z34 option, which came with the atrociously unreliable dual twin cam 3.4 liter V6 from 95 to 97. Now, as awful as that engine was, it made respectable horsepower, besting the G-body Monte SS by 20 horse. Unfortunately, you'd still get passed by a G-body Monte SS in a drag race anyway, because your timing belt would snap, well, about at the 100-foot mark. So once GM figured out that they had bungled the entire project and gave us a really crappy two-door Lumina that thought get us to buy the Monte Carlo in droves, they finally got rid of the 3.4 liter dual fail cam V6 and went with the Buick 3800, which we all know is bulletproof and also provided 200 horse. Crazy, they could have done that in the first place. So, after 4 years of this blobby, almost a Carlo, we got a huge tease coming in to the year 2000 and the new millennium. GM and Chevrolet put on their websites a tease of the new 6th gen Monte Carlo, where we saw the prototype, which didn't look too bad. Looked Monte Carlo-y, with a return to the retro style taillights that the G bodies had, and the return of the night badge that left the Monte Carlo in 88. It was revised, it was modern, and well, in 2000, when I was 12, 13 years old, I was ecstatic because they also said it would be return of the Monte SS. Oh, finally, we've got a tease of a new Monte with the Knights emblem and the return of the SS. Just think of how excited I wasn't when it came back to be another front-wheel drive Impala W-body based car with a 200 horsepower 3800 V6. Now, admittedly, the Monte SS was not a bad looking car. They had specific wheels. Instead of using, the Impala LS's wheels, which are styled off the old Impala SS's wheels that would have looked good on an SS Monte Carlo, they went with a different one and put those wheels on the LS. But hey, I don't count the beans at GM, so. The Monte Carlo stayed as it would until 2004, where the supercharged Monte Carlo would finally be introduced after every other W-body car in GM would get a supercharger, but let's get to the Monte finally, and eventually would become its own model until 2006, so 04, 05 would basically become the only model Monte SS was supercharged. The non-supercharged, naturally aspirated 3.8 became the Monte Carlo LT in 2005. So, bunch of changes nobody cares about. They got 240 horse when it got supercharged initially, so that's kind of nice. And finally, in 2006, GM would finally listen. We want a V8 Monte SS. And once you know it, GM gave us a 5.3 liter, 303 horse LS4 V8 underhood of the 2006 Monte Carlo SS. And you see the muscular front end on that car, and you walk up and pop the hood, and it's still sideways. God damn it! But it's a V8 SS, which had to be successful, right? Because everyone wants a V8 Monte Carlo SS. But the problem was, GM wasn't listening, made it wrong wheel drive, and it went dead in 2007. Thanks, GM, for frickin' nothing. Well, I guess this is a conclusion. GM, yet again, kills a famous nameplate because they refuse to listen. In the era where Mopar is releasing cheap, affordable four-door muscle cars and reintroducing what ended up being the most popular two-door muscle car once again, they gave us a front-wheel drive Monte SS with a V8. And it died. Imagine that. Now, that's why I call the G-Body Monte SS the last successful muscle car GM ever produced. Because you could argue, well, the Chevy SS, the Pontiac G8, the Pontiac GTO, and based on their performance figures, I would agree, except they weren't successful. Because GM sucks at doing anything but peddling trash to soccer moms and SUVs and Malibus. They thought anyone that wants a performance car is going to think that a Camaro is practical or a Corvette's practical. Just stuff your kids in the back, whatever. They don't need a beautiful rear drive V8 powered car that give you a little excitement while hustling a family to your in-laws that you don't want to go to, and the only reason you're going is so you can enjoy the drive there and back. No, you want an Equinox, don't you? Well, so why do I love the G-Body Monte SS just so damn much? Well, truth be told, when I was born in 1987, I'm fairly certain this was the car I was brought home in, an 86 Monte SS, black, with the red and orange stripes and a gray interior, of course, the 15-inch aluminum wheels. And that car, from the day that I can form memories, formed who I was going to be. So this is the fault of that. Just so you know. So blame GM that I am the way I am. But this car I was absolutely obsessed with. It's just still the most amazing car to me. It's one of the best looking. No, I'm going to say it right now. It is the best looking car to come out of GM in the 80s. The meanest looking car to come out of GM in the 80s. And I know you Buick guys. You're sitting there going, Grand National's the meanest looking car. I mean, their ad campaign was Mr. Vader, here's your car. Calm down. It's a black Buick Regal. Nothing against the Grand National. I love them. They're the best performance car of the 80s. It's just a black Regal. If you can take your car from mundane to mean with just paint, it's not that mean. Same thing goes with the 442 or the Hearst Olds. It's a special paint package on an otherwise normal car. They even use the same wheels as the base Cutlass. The Grand Prix, other than the 2+2, I mean, even the 2+2 was a performance flop and a love it or hate it styling. There was nothing as mean as a Monte SS on the roads because it was not your mundane, everyday Monte Carlo. You saw that front end coming at you. And in the 80s, when 180 horsepower scared people, it's like, holy shit, we got to get out of the way. And especially in 85, 86, where they outline the grill. Oh, but that's why I love this car so much. And ours, after the electronic quadrijet took a dump, because they all do, Dad threw a Holly on it. And then when the 204R took a dump, because most of them do when the front pumps decide to start going out, Dad put a TH350 in it with a shift kit. And that car was an icon in the small town I grew up in, along with his built 81 Camaro. And I was just, this car would roll around town, just chirp the tires, the 1-2 shift, not even trying. So it was just so damn cool. And that's why I love it so much and why I still lust for it to this day. And if you guys love this car that much, let me know in the comments. Or if there's a car that you love that you want me to cover, throw it down there. And while you're down there, leaving a comment, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you are subscribed, make sure you still are. YouTube does some weird stuff. And hit the bell icon so you know when new videos are coming out. And other than that, you can follow me on social media to see updates on builds when new videos are coming out, or just general other things that are going on with the channel on Facebook at T.N.T Garage and Performance, and on Instagram at T.N.T Garage and Performance. Go ahead, check out some videos. You know, give everything a look, give everything a like, and remember, until next time, if it ain't broke, fix it till it is. We'll see you soon.